With a whole lot of pleasure that I introduce our first speaker of the evening, who will share with us his insight on the connections between our current food, climate, and economic crises, as well as the democratic responses that can lead to a more sustainable and equitable systems. Raj Patel, we're very happy that you're here with us tonight and very grateful that you accepted the invitation. Raj is an award-winning writer, activist, and academic. It's a great combination. He has degrees from the University of Oxford, London School of Economics, and Cornell, has worked for the World Bank and WTO, and then subsequently protested against them around the world. He's currently a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley Center for African Studies, an honorary research fellow at the School of Development Studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and a fellow at the Institute for Food and Development Policy, also known as Food First. He's testified about the causes of the global food crisis to the U.S. House Financial Services Committee, and is an advisor to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to food. In addition to numerous scholarly publications, he regularly writes for The Guardian, which is one of the places I read him, and has contributed to the LA Times, New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, and it goes on and on and on. And his first book was Stuffed and Starved, which is the one I've read and been, no, stuffed ever since. No, that's not. The Hidden Battle for the World Food System, and his latest, The Value of Nothing, which is a New York Times bestseller. Please join me in warmly welcoming Raj Patel.
Can you hear me? You can. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Bonsoir à tous. J'arrive pas à parler en français parce que mon accent est incompréhensible. Donc, il faut que je parle en anglais. And what it is that I want to say is actually no surprise to anyone here. What I want to talk about is how markets fail and how we can move beyond them. Because it's very clear that markets have failed, and you don't have to believe me. You can take it from Alan Greenspan, the architect of our modern, sort of financial, the modern sort of free market fundamentalist society in which we live. Because Alan Greenspan was called to testify in front of Congress in 2008 when the markets were falling apart, and he was made to suffer. And for people on the left, there's a certain amount of schadenfreude that we got while watching Alan Greenspan squirm. Because when he was in front of Congress, he admitted that there was a flaw in his free market ideology. He admitted that the system that he thought had been working very well for the past 40 years, a system in which unfettered free markets and pure greed would lead to the best of all possible worlds. Well, he believed that this impossible system had worked very well for the past 40 years, and he had to admit when it came crashing down that there was a flaw in his model. Now, the thing is that when the media reported this, they reported it as a moment of, Alan Greenspan gets it wrong. Alan Greenspan, poor Alan Greenspan. Guy's an idiot, what can you do? And yet, it wasn't taken nearly as seriously as it should have been. If the Pope got up in front of the television cameras and said, "God, we just made him up. Doesn't even have a beard." If the Dalai Lama said, "Violence does solve everything," well, we'd hear about it. Questions would be asked, I think. But when Alan Greenspan gets up and admits that the entire, the sort of core idea behind free market fundamentalism is flawed, most people skipped over it. Because it would be too big to imagine what a different kind of economy would be like. And that's why it's such an honor for me to be sitting in a room full of people who have that imagination and who have the capacity to understand that what we need to do is go beyond capitalism. And so what I want to do is sort of share some ideas from economics and from some of the social movements that I've been able to work with about what we might be moving toward. And one of those ideas is an idea that won the Nobel Prize, or rather, the woman who invented this, who has been researching this idea for a while, won the Nobel Prize in economics last year, the first time the prize has ever been won by a woman. And we'll get back to that in a second. The woman's name is Elinor Ostrom, and the system that she has spent a lot of time looking at is the commons. Now, most people don't really understand the commons. I mean, when I was growing up in Britain, you know, we used to hear and see the House of Commons on television. And if you try and derive what the House of Commons is from watching the House of Commons, if you try and understand what the commons means from watching the House of Commons, you might think the commons is a sort of drinking club for aggressively drunk white men. Which it is. I mean, the House of Commons is the only bar in London that's open 24 hours. But you might think, I mean, when I first came to North America, my family, we were very excited because we came to New York. And we were told by everyone in New York, everyone in London, when you go to New York, you must go to Woodbury Common. Because it is a thing of beauty and splendor, and there is not the like in Europe. And so we were all very excited. We got on the bus to New Jersey, where Woodbury Common is. And it turned out that Woodbury Common is an outlet mall. In Europe, we didn't have outlet malls, and we wondered, we walked the aisles of this outlet mall, and it was beautiful. And so from this, I concluded that commons must mean American for shopping. But most of us get the commons wrong in a different way. We get the commons wrong in terms of the tragedy of the commons. And this is an idea that actually sort of has some fairly deep roots.
Keep going.
Oh, sorry. So this is an idea that has some deep roots. So the tragedy of the commons, if you're unaware of it, the whole idea of the tragedy of the commons is that, imagine that we're a village. All of us are villagers, and we are selfish and greedy. And in the middle of our village is a forest which nobody owns. And so because we are selfish and greedy, we will go into that forest and we will use it. We will shoot, squirrels. We will forage for nuts and berries. We will chop down trees and take them home and burn them. And because no one is stopping us, we will continue to do this. And because we are greedy, we won't stop ourselves. And through this combination of a lack of ownership of the forest, and because we are selfish and greedy, we will destroy the forest. And this is the tragedy of the commons. Now, this idea of the tragedy of the commons is one that was published in 1968 as a think piece in the journal Science. It actually never had any evidence. There's no evidence to support this idea of the tragedy of the commons. And if you look back historically, it turns out that actually people are really good at managing resources that nobody owns. In fact, the commons needed to be destroyed for capitalism to flourish. And these systems of managing resources together, they work because the premises of the tragedy of the commons, well, those premises are flawed. Just because nobody owns something doesn't mean that it can't be managed together. And yes, of course, we are selfish and greedy people, but we are not just selfish and greedy. We may have selfish genes, and I think we all believe in evolution here. I'm not in America now. I can safely assume that everyone here is down with the idea of evolution. And the idea is, in order for us to evolve, in order for us to survive as primates, yes, we are selfish, but we also have the capacity to be generous, to be altruistic, to make up our own rules and regulations and to stick to them. And it turns out, even in Western civilization, even among the most selfish people known in Western civilization, even among graduate economics students, who are scientifically proven the most selfish people our culture is able to generate, even they do not behave entirely selfishly all the time. Even they have modicums of self-restraint and behavior that is cooperative, that is generous, that is trusting, that is altruistic. And so in order for us to survive, our genes may be selfish, but we are not only selfish. And so it turns out that when you give communities enough space to manage their economic affairs, we do very well as human beings. And this isn't some purely academic exercise. There was a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences last year looking at how communities, forest communities in particular, manage their resources. And in the communities that first were given enough forest to be able to safely manage it, and if they make a mistake or if disaster strikes, they can recover. So communities that have enough space to be able to learn from their mistakes and to be able to survive the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And the communities that are given enough autonomy, freedom from the free market and from government intervention. Communities that have the capacity to govern themselves with enough freedom and enough resources to be able to pick things up when things go wrong. Those communities have higher development indicators than when either the private sector or the developmental state comes in and tries to fix things. Those communities have not only better development indicators for their own citizens and for their own members, but they also sequester more carbon than forest communities that have private sector or the heavy hand of government intervention. And that to me suggests that there's something very important and very radical and very relevant about the idea of the commons. What makes the commons work is that an ecological and a political community occupy the same space. All of a sudden, when you make a mistake, you get to feel the consequences of that. I mean, right now, we're suffering the consequences of the mistakes of successive US administrations and of the greed of people on Wall Street. But when the mistakes that you make have a space to be able to feed back into your own political process, that's how commons learn. And that's how we can learn to be able to make our political and our ecological communities match in ways that are sustainable. So, I mean, I think that there's a great deal that we can get from this idea of the commons. But I don't want to celebrate the commons uncritically. Because just as markets can fail, so can communities. And that's something I want to spend a little bit of time talking about here, because I think that it's very possible for us to imagine an economy different from the one in which we find ourselves, but in some ways replicating the failures or trying to disavow the failures of the past. Because the way that we consume today is unsustainable, and we should be very clear about that. We're living in the middle of the greatest market failure in human history, and that market failure is climate change. The way that we consume today and the energy footprint that we have is entirely unsustainable and unjust. Because the way that we get to where we are today is premised on the exploitation and suffering of people in developing countries. We need to be clear about that too. If we had to pay for the level of consumption that we in rich countries have had for the past 40 years, if we had to pay for the social and economic costs of mangrove deforestation, of water use intensification, of land degradation, the hole in the ozone layer, of the 300,000 deaths that happen every year already because of climate change. If we had to pay for all that over the past 40 years, according to a very conservative estimate from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences last year, we would owe developing countries, us in rich countries, would owe poor countries $5 trillion. Now, the way that things look at the moment, just to put that into perspective, third world debt, the so-called debt that the global south owes the global north, is $1.8 trillion. But if we were to own our debt, if we were to have memory to understand how it is we got to where we are today, just over the past 40 years, on the most conservative of indicators, we owe developing countries more than twice what we claim they owe us. And so if we're serious about an economy that is transformative, we need to own our debt. And we need to recognize what it is that we owe developing countries. This isn't just about meeting Millennium Development Goals. It's about paying our fair share for the damage we have already caused. But there's another way in which the commons can fail. It's entirely possible for a commons-based, sustainable system to reproduce the patterns of power that we see today, the inequalities in power that obtain throughout society. And that's what I want to talk about most, because I've been privileged enough to work with a movement, an international peasant movement, called Via Campesina. Via Campesina has over 150 million members around the world. The National Farmers Union in Canada is one of the many members in Canada, but there are members, as I say, the millions in the Karnataka State Farmers Association in India, or the Brazilian Landless Rural Workers Movement, a range of organizations, member-driven organizations around the world. And they've been fighting for sustainability, and they've been fighting for transformation in the way the economy works for a very long time. And for them, they've had a vision for particularly how our food system can change. And what they're saying is that they want a food system in which democracy can flourish. Now, unfortunately, the democracy that we live in at the moment isn't really a democracy. We should be clear about that. I mean, the kind of democracy where you vote once every couple of years, and you throw out the bastards who have disappointed you, and you install new bastards who will then disappoint you for just a few years later. That's not democracy. That's a complainocracy. A democracy, I mean, if one sort of wants to go to the roots of the word, I mean, a democracy, for example, as in Athens, the classical democracy, which had all kinds of problems, none of which I want to apologize for. Classical democracy had this idea that citizens were chosen at random by lottery at the beginning of every year, 6,000 citizens chosen at random. And those citizens would run the city for a year and then would disband, and another 6,000 would be chosen. That's what democracy is about, that constant civic engagement, not the putting an X into a box and walking away and discarding one's duties of citizenship, but actually taking citizenship seriously. But what La Via Campesina have observed is that for democracy to work, we need to challenge inequalities in power. For a democracy to work, we need equality, not only at the World Trade Organization, but all the way down where inequality happens. And so, at a meeting where Via Campesina was struggling with the food system and these inequalities in power, they observed very recently, this was in Mozambique where they held their latest summit, that as a movement, they'd gone as far as they could go without seriously confronting sexism within the movement itself. And La Via Campesina has for a long time been aware of gender inequality. In La Via Campesina there is a women's forum, and then there's also a gender forum, because gender and women are obviously not the same thing, right? The Women's Forum is a space in which the women in Via Campesina organized around their issues. The Gender Forum was where the inequalities in power were confronted, and the hard work of transformation began. And so that's why in their latest incarnation, the latest vision of food sovereignty is the idea of bringing democracy into the food system. Their latest slogan for food sovereignty is this, that food sovereignty, the possibility of having democracy in our food system, is about an end to all forms of violence against women. Food sovereignty is about an end to all forms of violence against women. Now, this may seem very far from discussions around ecology, around making ecology and politics meet, around sustainability, about fighting Monsanto and fighting corporate-led globalization, which Via Campesina does, make no mistake, that's on the agenda too. But by talking about food sovereignty as about an end to all forms of violence against women, you're also being incredibly practical. 60% of the billion-plus people who go hungry today are women or girls. That inequality in power is one that isn't just about inequalities at the World Trade Organization, but it's about the inequalities that prevent girls from going to school because they are needed in the fields, that pay women less for the same work as men, and that result in the violence, physical and psychological and social, in the most intimate of spaces, within the home. And that's why, in transforming the world, Via Campesina have this vision of radical social change that starts in the most intimate of spaces, but ends up challenging capitalism at its roots. Because actually, the largest subsidy, I mean, we could talk about the 5 billion that rich countries owe poor countries, but the largest subsidy that capitalism gets is from unpaid labor and unpaid women's work. In 1995, researchers at the United Nations did the math, and they discovered that 50% of the world's total output is unpaid women's work. 50% of the world's global output is unpaid women's work, the work of taking care of kids, the work of maintaining households, of caring for the elderly, work that is invariably done by women, and which is utterly unpaid for in the economy that we have today. And it is possible for the economy we have tomorrow also to reproduce that, and we cannot afford it. And so that's why, in closing up, I think it's important for us to be inspired, to be able to make these radical changes and to understand quite how radical they will be. And for Via Campesina, it's a struggle. There's nothing guaranteed about me as a man, for we men, to take seriously the privilege with which we have been brought up, and to pluck the patriarchy out of our hearts. I now have a 3-month-old son, and I'm going to be bringing him up as best I can to try and avoid the sort of privileges of primogeniture, the privileges of patriarchy. But it's not work that can be done alone, because step out of our house and we are assaulted by cultural images of what boys should do and what girls should do, cultural images of what men's work is and what women's work is, about how private property needs to, how we need a world that's filled with private property, but not public property. And if we are to have a sustainable economy, if we are to have a planet for my son to grow up in and for your children to grow up on, we're going to have to reach pretty deep into the ways that we conceive of ourselves. And that's not work that we can do alone, but it's work that we need to do together. And so the question is, well, are we going to succeed? And my friend Bill McKibben has a way of putting it that I think is wonderful. He says, look, if you're a betting person, you might bet that we will not succeed. You might bet that patriarchy will remain. You might bet that we will not be able to save the planet from further rises in temperature. We might not be able to curb our use of fossil fuels, to be able to shift to a sustainable economy, not just here, but worldwide. You might bet against us, but that's not a bet you're allowed to make. You have to bet that we will win. You have to bet that we will, together, get there. And that's work that I'm looking forward to learning from you about, looking forward to fighting with you together to be able to make that world happen. And with that, I'm looking forward to the conversation that's coming up next and the lessons that we can all share with each other. Thank you, my comrades.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you so much. You have to stay up here. Stay up. Stay up. You're not leaving yet. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives in terms of a people-centered economy. I certainly gain a lot more understanding in terms of the tragedy of the commons. I also really, what I take away is the whole quote, and I will quote you on that, in terms of the food sovereignty would end violence against women. That's a very strong statement, and I have to spend some time thinking about that. Thank you so much. I also appreciated your gender lens in terms of the transformation that we're all working towards and continue to work towards. I have a little gift from you. It's a book entitled Century of Cooperation, and it's a historical perspective of the cooperatives in Canada and also what is happening right now in all sorts of different sectors, and we're very excited by this book. It was published this year, and we thank you so much for coming and sharing your perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you so much.